I'm the multimillionaire that is selling his dream home. Not because I don't want to own a home, because the numbers simply do not justify it anymore. You're being lied to about what property actually costs. Stop buying based on identity and start buying based on numbers. Welcome back, guys. I'm Dan Thompson, a multi-business founder, chartered wealth manager, and a multimillionaire that is selling his dream home. Not because I don't want to own a home, because the numbers simply do not justify it anymore. And in this video, I'm going to break down why a lot of young founders and multimillionaires, just like myself, have no interest in owning their own home anymore and what actually builds wealth long term. So at the minute, guys, my dream home is currently on the market. This video isn't about me saying never buy property. I'm certainly not anti-property. This is more about me saying you're being lied to about what property actually costs, whether it's an investment or your main home. And this video is more about a mental shift in thinking, because more and more people I know, especially founders, business owners, multimillionaires, aren't buying homes anymore, even when they can obviously afford them. And it's not because they're broke, it's because the numbers simply do not justify it. And the reason is simple. They're starting to realize that the old rules no longer apply in today's world. So today I'm going to break down the real costs of buying a home, the myths people often repeat, and the framework that I've seen wealthy people use for years. And I'll also be sharing something really personal, why I'm currently selling my dream home back in the UK, and the lesson it's taught me that most people just never learn. So let's talk about the dream that everyone gets sold. Most people grow up believing that buying a house or owning a home is the ultimate sign you've made it, almost like a definition of success. And here's the thing that most people don't actually say out loud or even really understand. That belief was built in a different world than today. In previous generations, property was often a lot more affordable, especially relative to income. It was cheaper relative to individuals' income back then. It was more affordable to maintain. It was less punishing to transact property, going back some time ago. And it was easier to hold for the long term without you being financially squeezed. But now, people are still following the old rules in what is a completely new game. That's why you see people almost stretching themselves to breaking point to buy a house to feel successful while their actual net worth is so fragile. So decades ago, a home purchase looked a little like this. So a house price would be give or take 2.5 times your annual income. You would put circa 20% down as a deposit, and your total housing cost would be around 30% of your gross income. And that would include, the mortgage, maintenance, taxes, insurance, as an example, all in. So let's make this a little bit more real and use an example. If you were on a 50k salary, under the old rules, your home would cost around £125,000, at a 2.5x income. If you put down £25,000, which is about 20% of the house value, your all-in monthly cost would sit at around £1,250 per month. Now, ask yourself honestly, do you know anywhere you'd want to genuinely live that costs £125,000 with costs that low? And that's my point. The market has changed, but people still are using outdated logic and wondering why they're feeling squeezed. So guys, here's the reality. People move more. They change countries. They take business or career risks more than they used to. They need more flexibility or want more optionality or want more liquidity. And more people are waking up to this. Buying a home isn't the grown-up thing to do anymore. It's viewed more as an anchor by many people. And if you're buying at a 5, 7 or even 10 times multiple of your annual income with a tiny deposit, in my opinion, this is modern day madness, because that's not a dream, that's a stress machine. And this is especially true when it comes to a lot of individuals that I know who are choosing now flexibility over ownership, even when they have the ability to buy. And it's really coming down to the fact that they're asking smarter questions nowadays. Does this purchase increase my net worth or my freedom? Or does it reduce it? And for many individuals I know, buying a home early can create a fixed cost base, higher stress levels, less investment flexibility or optionality, especially when it comes to the opportunity cost of other potentially more lucrative investment options, and less flexibility to take bigger swings in their business or their career. Right, so now I want to talk about the 4 big myths when it comes to property and blast these out of the water. So number 1, property always goes up. I hear this, or I've heard this so many times over the 15 years of my career, bricks and mortar, you can't go wrong, etc, etc, etc. And no, it doesn't. The 2008 financial crisis proved exactly this. property does go down as well as up, like most asset classes. And even when prices don't drop publicly, the market often discounts in other ways that are hard for a lot of people to recognize. And that might be rate buy downs, incentives, months free, things that effectively reduce the real price without cutting it per se. And the point isn't whether prices rise. The point is, what did it actually cost you to buy the property when you factor in all the costs? Right, so myth number 2, my house doubled so I made money. And that's not necessarily true, because a lot of people ignore what's called phantom costs. These are kind of like the invisible costs that a lot of people don't really notice or pick up on as much. So to use some examples, that could be transaction costs of buying and selling. It could be maintenance and repairs. It could be insurance, services, taxes, fees, renovations, upgrades, or what I like to call the Home Depot lifestyle. So people spending money on their home to make it feel nice and homely. And as we know, homes can be money pits when it comes to cash. I've been guilty of this myself when doing what was going to be my dream home. And you can actually sell a house for more than you paid for it, however, still lose money because of phantom costs when you actually factor them in and include them. And this is something which most people forget to factor in. And sadly, one of the reasons I'm making this video is I fell for this myself. So a few years ago, I bought what was going to be hopefully my forever home, and although I've made money on the property itself, it has appreciated in value. Sadly, I invested a lot of money into making it feel like a home, did a lot of work to the house, and realistically, have I made my money back on the property? Probably not when I include the phantom costs. Right, so myth number 3, leverage makes property a no-brainer. And the thing to know or really acknowledge is leverage works both on the way up, but also on the way down. It magnifies gains, but also magnifies losses. And if property drops back by, say, 10%, give or take, you don't actually lose 10% of the value. You lose a huge proportion of your equity, and you could even be wiped out. And that has happened in previous financial crises. And that's all down to people sometimes being over-leveraged. So leverage is not a free cheat code. Right, myth number 4 and the final myth. So renting is throwing your money away. What a load of nonsense. This is one of the most damaging phrases when it comes to personal finance, because rent isn't throwing your money away. Rent is paying for flexibility, it's paying for optionality, it's paying for convenience, it's paying for predictable costs, and it's also giving you the ability to deploy capital elsewhere, that opportunity cost we talked about earlier in the video. So the real question is, what's the total cost of owning versus renting, and what do you do with the difference? Which takes me to the most important part. Always run the numbers. Here's the rule I want you to remember. Do not buy a house without running the numbers and doing the math. Don't make a decision based on vibe, social pressure, because your mates are buying, because your parents told you to do so, or because you don't understand your options. Do your research. And you don't even need to take that from me. A proper calculation will include things like mortgage costs, service charges and maintenance, insurance, taxes, fees, expected repairs, these little costs that people often miss, transaction costs. But the big one is the opportunity cost of deploying that capital, the deposit and the extra monthly outlay elsewhere, because you can then compare it to what would it cost to rent an equivalent home, and what could you do with the difference in the extra cash or capital you'd have available. Right, so let me give you an example, because I've got a friend down in London who tracked an identical property to his own, same square footage, same view, and the rent was about £3,000 per month, but the cost to own the equivalent was £6,600 a month. So that's roughly a 2.2x multiple in terms of being more expensive to own. So what did he do? He decided to rent and invest the difference elsewhere. And that's £3,600 per month that can go into the market, or any investment for that matter, and there's no renovations, there's no stress with repairs, there's no weekend DIY, there's just the invested delta. So that's just a fancy word for investing the excess funds that he had left over as a result of renting instead of buying. And if ownership costs materially more, it might still be worth it. But what you've got to then accept is it's a lifestyle choice, and not pretend, it's not automatically a great investment. And that distinction is everything. Right, so let me share something really personal, because I'm selling what I consider to be my dream home. And this has been really hard because I've had so many people kindly comment on the home I've got back in the UK, saying kind of it's their end game. And, you know, it's really, really been a difficult or challenging decision for me to make. And it's not because I failed. It's not because it was a disaster in any way, but it's because in the last year or so, I've realized something most people will struggle to understand. A house can be emotionally perfect. And for me, my home in the UK was emotionally perfect. I invested so much time and energy into making it the dream home, but strategically, it ended up being wrong for my life. And if you're building businesses or moving around internationally or need more flexibility with your career, or you're scaling, investing, or even taking some sort of calculated risks, sometimes the smartest move is to prioritize flexibility, liquidity, optionality over permanence. And selling my dream home hasn't become a loss to me. It was a super valuable lesson because freedom is now way more valuable to me than the appearance of stability or the appearance of wealth even. And I now have more optionality, I have more flexibility, I have the greater opportunity to deploy that capital elsewhere where it's way more effective. Right guys, so I want to be clear, I am not anti-property. You know, there is times when buying your main home or a home makes perfect sense because it can be a brilliant decision when you're going to stay long enough to justify the transaction costs, or you can comfortably afford it without stretching yourself, or when you've got a buffer for the repairs or for life events, or you're still investing potentially alongside owning the home and you're buying it primarily as a home as opposed to it not being part of a general wealth plan, as I would probably call it. And as a rule of thumb, a lot of people suggest that buying is a good option if you're going to hold the property for 10 years and above, because you need to spread the transaction costs of that property over a longer period to make it worth it almost. And one of the biggest traps I see people fall into is treating their house like it's their main wealth engine. And a house is often a great lifestyle option or purchase. It's a form of almost like forced savings for a lot of people. Without it, they may not actually save the money and they could be quite reckless. And it's sometimes a really decent investment. I'm talking very generically in this video, but it's rarely the best investment vehicle for disciplined long-term investors. Now, something I want to do is caveat this section because there is a time and a place where it is well worth an individual buying their own home, especially when they've been super successful. So if, for example, someone already has a very diversified portfolio, investments elsewhere, and they decide to buy their main home, you know, and it makes up 20% of their net worth, there is no reason why they would not do that, you know, not have the security and not have their money in a different type of asset class. And that's not really the point of this video, but it's worth noting that there is exceptions, of course, to the rule. So let me land with this. And this is the real message of today's video. You know, the goal shouldn't be to own your own home. The goal should be to build a life with security, flexibility, freedom, and optionality. And for a growing number of people I know, especially younger founders, you know, it's becoming increasingly more common. Owning a home early isn't a path to freedom. It's actually an anchor that slows you down. So here's the takeaway. Stop buying based on identity and start buying based on numbers, because people who win long term don't follow the rules of decades past. They run the spreadsheet, they run the numbers, they make the call, and they live with confidence.